The alien ship was quiet at 0200 hours. Most of the crew was asleep, and the long corridor outside the mess hall was empty except for one figure crewman. First Class Jake Mercer was not walking, he was surviving. He moved along the wall with one hand pressed flat against the cold metal surface and his knees slightly bent and his face doing something that no human face should ever do in public. He was grimacing and sweating and making a very low sound deep in his chest like a machine that was slowly running out of power. His stomach was the problem. It had been the problem since approximately 2,300 hours the night before, when Jake had made what he would later describe as a strategic error. He had found a single can of rehydrated earth beans at the bottom of his personal supply box. The beans were old and the label was half torn, and they smelled exactly like home, and so he had eaten all of them, every single one, without thinking about consequences. That was a very human thing to do now. It was 0200 and the consequences had arrived, and they had brought their entire family with them. His stomach was swollen and hard, and it felt like something alive was pressing outward from the inside, and every step he took sent a fresh wave of pressure rolling through his gut, and he needed privacy, and he needed it immediately. But the crew bathrooms were at the far end of the corridor, and the corridor was very long, and Jake was not moving very fast. He stopped walking. He bent forward slightly and gripped the wall with both hands and closed his eyes and breathed through his nose. He could do this. He was a human being. Humans had survived ice ages and plagues and their own coking, and this was just gas. It was just gas. He told himself this. Very firmly down the corridor behind him, a door slid open with a soft hiss. Dr. Vexala stepped out. She was the chief medical officer of the GCS Unbroken Accord, and she was Sorvathy, which meant she had 6 limbs and bioluminescent patches along her neck that changed color with her emotions, and 4 dark eyes that missed almost nothing. She had graduated at the top of her class at the Coalition Medical Institute and had 32 years of field experience, and she had seen things that would make most species faint, but she had never seen anything like this. She saw Jake from 20 meters away, and she stopped walking completely. Her neck patches went from their resting pale blue to a deep and immediate orange. Orange meant alarm. Orange meant something is very wrong. She saw the bent posture. She saw the 2 hands flat on the wall. She saw the swollen abdomen pressing against his uniform. She saw the sweat on his face and the tight closed eyes and the slow, terrible way he was breathing in. Sorvathy medicine. These signs together meant one thing: stage 3 visceral collapse. It was a condition where the internal digestive sacs ruptured and released toxic fluid into the body cavity, and the pressure built until the organs failed. One by one, it was almost always fatal. It killed within minutes if untreated. Vexala did not hesitate. She slammed the emergency panel on the wall beside her with 2 of her hands at the same time. The ship woke up. Red light filled the corridor, and a calm, automated voice began speaking in 6 languages, and doors burst open all along the hallway, and crew members stumbled out blinking and confused, and the sound of boots on metal floors rose quickly from nothing to thunder. Jake opened his eyes. He looked at the red lights. He looked at the crew pouring into the corridor. He looked at Dr. Vexala, who was already running toward him with her medical scanner extended and her neck patches now a blazing dark red. He opened his mouth to say something. His translator badge chose that exact moment to go. Dark. The power cell cracked 2 days ago during a maintenance shift, and Jake had been meaning to replace it and had not gotten around to it yet because he was human, and humans sometimes put off small tasks until those small tasks became enormous problems. He tapped the badge. Nothing. He tapped it again. Still nothing. Vexala reached him, and her scanner was already moving over his abdomen in fast, precise arcs, and her 4 eyes were reading the numbers, and her neck was going colors that Jake had never seen before. He did not know what those colors meant. He would later learn that the color she turned in that moment did not even have a name in Standard Galactic. It was a color that Sorvathy only produced in genuine moments of medical terror. Jake pointed at his stomach. He made a gesture with his hand. He tried to make the gesture mean it is okay. I just need 1 minute, and a private Vexala read the gesture as the pain is becoming unbearable. She spoke rapidly into her communicator across the ship. In the lower medical bay, surgical drones came online. Their arms unfolded in the dark like silver flowers opening, and their systems ran diagnostic checks, and their cutting tools rotated once slowly. And then, locked into ready position, Jake watched two crew members unfolding a medical transport stretcher. He watched Prill, the young Davani medic, come sprinting around the corner with a full emergency kit bouncing against his forelegs and his mandibles clicking so fast they were almost a blur. Jake held up both hands. He shook his head. He pointed at his stomach again and then pointed down the corridor toward the bathroom and tried very hard to make his face say, "I just need to walk about 40 more meters and everything will be fine." Prill read his face as the patient is delirious. This was also a symptom of stage 3, visceral collapse. They lowered him onto the stretcher. Jake did not fight it very hard because honestly he was tired. And the pressure in his stomach was significant, and being horizontal was not the worst thing in the world. He stared up at the red ceiling lights as they wheeled him down the corridor, and he could hear the ship around him, fully awake now and alert, and the sound of the medical bay doors opening ahead and the hum of machines coming online. He took a slow breath. He thought about the beans. He thought about the fact that his translator was broken. He thought about the 34 aliens on this ship, who were all currently in a state of what appeared to be genuine fear on his behalf. He felt a complicated emotion that was somewhere between being very touched and being very embarrassed. He also still very urgently needed to do the thing he had been trying to do for the past 20 minutes. The medical bay doors closed behind him. With a sound like a held breath somewhere deep in the ship, the surgical drones waited. Their systems were ready, their tools were ready. Dr. Vesala walked in behind the stretcher and pulled on her surgical gloves, and her neck was still that nameless terrible color, and her 4 eyes were focused and serious, and she had already decided she was going to save this human. She did not know yet that the human did not need saving. She did not know yet that the human needed something much simpler, something much quieter, something that would change the way the entire galaxy thought about human beings forever. The medical bay of the GCS Unbroken Accord was the finest trauma facility in Sector 7. This was not an opinion. It was a documented fact recorded in the Coalition Fleet Registry and confirmed by 3 independent medical review boards. The bay had 12 active biobeds and a full surgical suite and atmospheric controls that could be adjusted for 17 different species, and scanning equipment so sensitive it could detect a change in a single cell. It had never failed a patient. Dr. Vesala intended to keep that record. She moved through the bay with fast, quiet steps, and her 6 hands were already doing different things at once. 2 were pulling up Jake's file on the central display. 1 was adjusting the biobed settings to match human atmospheric needs. 1 was holding her primary scanner, and the last one was gesturing to Prill, who was connecting monitoring leads to Jake's arms and chest with the careful, nervous energy of someone who had never worked on a human before, which he had not. Nobody on this ship had. Jake was the first human any of them had ever seen in person. He was currently lying flat on the biobed, staring at the ceiling with the expression of a man who was thinking very hard about something and trying not to show it. He had stopped trying to talk after the 3rd attempt to mime his situation was misread as signs of increasing agony. He had been given a mild sedative about 4 minutes ago, which had done almost nothing except make him briefly stare at his own hand with an expression of quiet wonder for about 30 seconds, and then returned to looking uncomfortable. Vesala positioned her scanner over his abdomen and began the deep resonance imaging. The results came back in less than 10 seconds. She looked at them. She looked at them again. She turned the display slightly to make sure the angle was not affecting the reading. It was not. She called Prill over with a soft word, and Prill leaned in, and his 4 eyes went wide, and his mandibles stopped clicking for the first time since he had entered the room. What the scanner showed them was not what either of them expected. Jake Mercer's internal anatomy was completely wrong, not wrong in the way a sick body is wrong, not wrong in the way an injured body is wrong, wrong in a deep structural impossible way, wrong like someone had taken a normal set of organs and then added extra pieces and rearranged everything and then coiled an absolutely unreasonable length of tubing through the middle of all of it. The intestines alone were extraordinary, and Sorvathy anatomy, the primary digestive canal, ran a clean and efficient 2 meters in Dovani. It was slightly longer at 3. The scanner was telling Vesala that Jake's intestinal tract was somewhere between 7 and 8 meters long. It was coiled in dense overlapping loops and packed so tightly into his body cavity that she genuinely could not understand how everything fit inside one human. His stomach showed two distinct chambers. He had a small dense organ on the lower right side of his abdomen that the scanner could not identify at all. It appeared to have no current function. It appeared to have never had a function. It was simply there like a biological footnote, like something evolution had written and then forgotten to erase. And then there was the gas. The resonance image showed large pockets of mixed gas distributed throughout his intestinal tract. The composition was complex and the pressure readings were significant, and in Sorvathy diagnostic terms, gas buildup of this density in the intestinal region, following visible abdominal distension and behavioral signs of acute distress, meant one thing very clearly: internal rupture of digestive sac. Stage 3, she called Commander Urathurith, was the ship's xenobiologist and the closest thing they had to a human expert, which was not very close at all. He was Vethany, which meant he was tall and pale and moved with the slow, careful deliberateness of a species that had evolved in low-gravity environments. He arrived in the medical bay within 2 minutes and stood beside Vexala and studied the scan in silence for a long moment. He made a sound that in Vethany meant, "This is deeply concerning." He reached past Vexala and expanded the gas pocket display. He made the sound again, but louder. Jake watched the three of them huddle over the screen. He could see his own insides on the display. He thought they looked roughly normal. He thought maybe the beans showed up somewhere in there. He tried once more to sit up and was gently but firmly pressed back down by Prill, who gave him a look of genuine compassion that across the species. Barrier translated quite clearly as, "Please do not fight." "US, we are trying to help you." Jake stopped fighting. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about explaining the beans. He thought about his broken translator. He thought about how the word for basic digestive discomfort probably did not exist in whatever language any of these people spoke natively. He pressed his lips together very hard. Orith pulled up the coalition database entry on Homo sapiens on a secondary screen beside the scanner display. The entry was not long. Humanity had joined the coalition 14 months ago, and the medical profile was still in early stages. It had some basic measurements and some atmospheric requirements, and a note that said humans were carbon-based omnivores with bilateral symmetry and a high tolerance for environmental stress. That was most of it. Roth scrolled to the bottom, hoping for more. There was a small section on diet. He read it again more slowly. He turned back to the scanner. He looked at the gas pockets. He looked at the section on diet, which mentioned that humans regularly consume decomposing organic matter in prepared form, and that fermentation byproducts were a normal part of their nutritional intake, and that the human digestive process produced significant quantities of mixed gas as a standard metabolic output. Standard metabolic output. Roth was very still for a moment. He was a scientist. He had spent 40 years studying biology across 40 species. He prided himself on reaching conclusions only when the evidence was complete and clear and thoroughly examined. The evidence was becoming clear. He looked at Vexalash, was already looking at him. Neither of them spoke on the biobed. Jake shifted his weight slightly, and his face did the thing again that it had been doing in the corridor. The tightened jaw and the careful, controlled breathing and the look of a man engaged in a very private internal negotiation. Vexel looked at the surgical suite. The drones were waiting. Their tools were out. Their training was clear, and her instincts were sharp, and everything in her 32 years of medicine was telling her that a patient in distress needed intervention, needed action, needed her to do something. She picked up her surgical tool. Orith put one long, pale hand gently on her arm. He pointed at the diet entry on the database. She read the relevant line for the second time: standard metabolic output. She put the surgical tool down very slowly on the biobed. Jake closed his eyes again. He was still holding on. He had been holding on for nearly an hour now. He was remarkably disciplined for someone in his situation, and this too would eventually be noted in the medical literature as an example of human physiological endurance, though the researchers who wrote that paper would struggle with how to phrase it with appropriate scientific dignity. The three of them stood around the biobed. The drones waited. The ship waited, and Jake Mercer, human being of Earth, lay very still and breathed very carefully and thought about nothing except The bathroom that was 40 meters away and the door that he could not currently reach. He was so close. He had been so close. Commander Urith pulled the full Homo sapiens file onto the largest display in the medical bay. He did this quietly and without announcement, and Vexala and Prill gathered on either side of him, and the three of them stood in a row and Reed changed something in all of them, not immediately, not all at once. It happened the way cold water rises. It started at the feet and moved upward slowly, and by the time it reached the top, there was no part of them left that was not affected. File began with the standard coalition intake profile: height, weight, atmospheric requirements, optimal temperature range, average lifespan. These numbers were unremarkable except for the lifespan, which was longer than expected for a species with no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory systems, and no documented psychic ability. Humans simply lived a long time through what the file described as biological stubbornness, which was not a medical term but had been included by the researcher who wrote the initial entry because they could not find a more accurate one. Then came the diet section. Humans consumed decomposing organic matter, not occasionally, not as a last resort. In every meal, every day by choice, they applied heat to raw animal tissue and plant matter, and then ate it and called this cooking, and had developed over thousands of years an elaborate cultural practice around the preparation and sharing of decomposing things. They had fermented beverages that were mildly toxic to most other known species. They consumed them socially. They had a tradition of fermenting vegetables in sealed containers and then eating the result. They had a practice of cultivating specific mold colonies on food and then eating the mold. They called this cheese, and they had reportedly very strong feelings about it. Prill made a small sound. Nobody responded because they were still reading. The immune system section was next. Human immune systems had been trained by millennia of contact with pathogens that still appeared on the Coalition Medical Hazard Registry. Diseases that had been classified as extinction-level threats for smaller species had swept through human populations repeatedly throughout their history, and the humans had not gone extinct. They had gotten sick and recovered, and their immune systems had noted the experience and updated themselves and moved on. The file listed 17 pathogens that humans carried without symptoms that would require immediate quarantine. Protocols for any Sorvathi who came into contact with them. Vexala looked at Jake. Jake was breathing carefully on the biobed. He had not moved much in the last few minutes. He appeared to be in a state of extreme focused concentration. She looked back at the file. The section on pain tolerance was short, but the numbers in it were not. Humans had a significantly higher pain threshold than the Coalition average. They had evolved this trait because their history had required it. The file noted that humans had historically performed surgery on each other without modern anesthetic, using only alcohol as a numbing agent, and that many humans had described this experience as unpleasant but survivable. The word unpleasant was doing a great deal of work, and that Sentenciorith scrolled down. He found the section he had been looking for: digestive gas production. He read it aloud in a low voice so the others could hear. The human digestive system produced gas as a continuous and normal byproduct of metabolic function. The gas was a mixture of several compounds and was produced in varying quantities depending on diet and individual biology. The gas was expelled from the body regularly through a process that was entirely involuntary in its generation and largely voluntary in its timing. The file noted that humans had a cultural awareness of this process and that it was considered a private matter in most human social contexts, though it was also a common subject of humor, particularly among younger humans, and that this humor had persisted across all known human cultures throughout recorded history, suggesting it was something close to a universal human experience. Prill read that last part twice. His mandibles had gone completely still. He turned and looked at Jake on the biobed. Jake had his eyes closed and his jaw was tight and his hands were flat on the biobed surface, and he was absolutely motionless in the way that a person is motionless when being still is the only thing standing between them and a situation they very much want to avoid. Prill looked back at the file. He looked at the gas pocket readings on the scanner. He looked at the dietary note from the crew meal log that Vexala had pulled up, which showed that Jake Mercer had signed out one personal supply item at 2,247 hours the previous evening. The item was listed as Earth Origin Preserved Legumes Rehydrated, one full container. He looked at Vexalash, was already looking at the scanner with an expression that Prill had never seen on her face before in 3 years of working beside her. It was not an expression from the standard medical training materials. It was something quieter and more complicated than Thatarath closed the file he turned to. Face the bio bed stood there for a long moment with his hands folded in front of him and his pale eyes moving slowly from the scanner to Jake and back again, and his expression was the expression of a scientist watching his framework reorganize itself around a new and deeply inconvenient piece of information in Sorvathi culture. There was a phrase that translated roughly as "the body tells the truth if you know how to listen." Vexala had believed in that phrase her entire career. She looked at Jake's readings: abdominal distension, yes; gas accumulation, yes; behavioral signs of acute distress, yes; and yet his core temperature was normal. His cardiac rhythm was steady. His blood pressure was within range. His cellular integrity scans showed no rupture, no leakage, no sign of internal damage of any kind. His body was not dying. His body was waiting. She understood the difference between those two things. She reached out and quietly switched off the active status on the surgical drone preparation sequence. The drones in the lower bay folded their arms back, and their lights went from green to standby amber, and the soft whirring of their tool systems faded into silence. Brill looked at her. She looked at the floor for a moment, then she looked at Jake, then she looked at the note in the file that said gas expulsion was largely voluntary in its timing. She thought about the corridor. She thought about the way Jake had been moving along the wall with both hands. She thought about how he had tried so many times to communicate something. She thought about the gesture he had made pointing at his stomach and pointing down the corridor, and how she had read it as pain is unbearable. She thought maybe she had read it wrong. She thought maybe he had been pointing at the bathroom. The medical bay was very quiet outside in the corridor. The ship's engineer, Grix, had apparently been listening to the internal com feed this entire time, because a message appeared on Vexala's secondary screen from Grix's station, and it said in very small textus, "The human okay," and then a second message appeared 3 seconds later that said because I pulled up the human diet file about 10 minutes ago, and I think I know what is happening. And then a third message that said, "I cannot stop making sounds. Please do not ask me to explain." Vexala looked at the messages. She looked at Jake. She made a decision. She crossed to the equipment drawer and took out the backup universal translator and brought it to Prill and said, "Fix this." And Prill took it with all 4 hands and began working on it immediately, because he was very good at his job, and also because he very much wanted to know what Jake was going to say when he could finally speak. The medical bay waited. The ship waited. Jake lay perfectly still on the bio bed and held on with everything he had. He had been holding on for 61 minutes. He was still holding. That was the thing about humans that no file could fully prepare you for. They endured, not because they were the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, but because they decided to, and then they simply did for 61 minutes and counting. Jake Mercer had decided. It was the most quietly remarkable thing that Vexala had ever witnessed. In 32 years of medicine, she did not know how to write that in a report. She was going to try anyway. Prill fixed the translator in 4 minutes and 30 seconds. This was a personal record. He had never repaired a power cell that fast in his life, and he was fairly certain he would never do it again, but there had been a quality to the silence in the medical bay that made his hands move faster than usual. It was the silence of a room full of people waiting for an answer to a question. They were almost afraid to confirm. He handed the translator to Vexalash, walked to the bio bed, leaned down slightly and pressed the translator gently into Jake's left hand and closed his fingers around it. And then she stepped back and folded 2 of her hands together and waited. Jake felt the familiar weight of the device in his palm. He opened his eyes. He looked at the translator. He looked at Vexala. He looked at Prill. He looked at Urth, who was standing a little further back with his arms folded and his expression carefully neutral, in the way of someone who has a strong hypothesis and is waiting very quietly to see if it is correct. Jake pressed the activation button on the side of the translator. It chimed softly. He took 1 breath. He said 5 words. He said them in a very flat and very tired and very earnest voice, because he had been awake since 2,300 hours. And he had been lying on a medical biobed for over an hour, and he was deeply sincere about what he needed. He said, "I just need to fart." The translator converted his words into standard galactic with perfect clarity. The medical bay received them. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. For approximately 3 full seconds, the room was more silent than space. And then Jake did not wait for a response, because he had been waiting for 63 minutes, and he was done waiting, and the translator was in his hand, and everything was about to be fine. And he sat up on the bio bed and swung his legs over the side and stood up. He stood up very straight. He took a short step, and then it happened. It was not quiet. The medical bay was a room built for precision and silence and advanced life-saving technology, and it was not acoustically prepared for this moment in any way. The sound moved through the room with a confidence that Jake himself had not had in over an hour. It was substantial. It was committed. It was the sound of a problem that had been building since 2,247 hours the previous evening, finally finding its resolution. Gas sensors on the bio bed read a spike and then returned to zero. Jake's abdominal distension visibly reduced. His vital signs on the wall display, which had been marked in cautious yellow for the past hour, shifted quietly back to green, one reading at a time. Like small lights turning on in a dark house, his posture changed. His shoulders dropped from around his ears, where they had been living for 63 minutes, down to their normal position. His jaw unclenched, his hands relaxed. The tight, careful, controlled look on his face simply dissolved, and underneath it was just Jake Mercer, ordinary human being of Earth, looking tired and relieved and extraordinarily embarrassed. He let out a long, slow breath. He rolled his neck once to the left and once to the right. He looked at the 3 medical staff. They were looking at him. They had not moved. Vexila was still standing exactly where she had been when she handed him the translator. Her 6 arms were at her sides, and her 4 eyes were tracking across his body, reading his vitals, reading his posture, reading every signal his body was sending, and processing what those signals meant. And her neck patches had gone from their dark emergency colors through several rapid transitions and had landed on something pale and faintly golden, which in Sorvathy physiology indicated an emotional state that did not have a clean translation, but existed somewhere between profound relief and the specific feeling of understanding something important about the universe that you had not understood before. Prill had sat down on the edge of a nearby equipment case. He was sitting very still. His mandibles were making a small rhythmic motion that was not quite clicking. It was something softer, something that Dovani did when they were processing something. Their mind was not entirely ready for Orith. Had not changed position at all. He was still standing with his arms folded, but something around his eyes had shifted, and he was looking at Jake the way a scientist looks at a result that confirms a theory they were hoping was wrong, because confirming it means the universe is stranger than they thought, and they have to go back and rethink several things. Jake opened his mouth. He said, "I'm so sorry." He said it very sincerely. He said, "I found beans in my kit last night, and I was homesick, and I ate all of them," which in retrospect was a mistake, "and my translator was broken, and I could not explain, and I am genuinely very sorry about all of this." He gestured vaguely at the medical bay and the surgical suite and the drones, which were still in standby, and the scattered equipment, and the fact that every member of the crew was apparently awake and gathered in the corridor outside. Based on the sounds coming through the door, Vexila looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the scanner. That was now showing his internal readings as completely healthy, completely normal, completely unremarkable. She looked at the surgical tools on the tray beside her. She thought about the drones. She thought about the alarm she had triggered. She thought about the 34 crew members who had been jolted out of sleep by emergency lights and were now standing in the corridor outside, waiting for news about the dying human. She thought about 32 years of medicine, and how in 32 years she had never once prepared a full surgical suite for a patient who needed to fart. She did something then that Jake had never seen her do before. She laughed. It was not a Sorvathy laugh, which was a quiet and controlled sound. It was a real laugh, something that started low in her chest and moved upward and came out of her with a force that surprised her, and she covered 2 of her mouths with 2 of her hands, and her neck patches went bright, bright gold, which was pure, uncomplicated joy, and she laughed. Until her eyes watered. Prill started making sounds too. His version was higher and faster, and his mandibles were clicking rapidly in a pattern that in Dovani meant something close to, "I cannot believe this is happening," but the genuine warmth in. It was clear across any species. Barrieruth made a single short sound that was very controlled and very dignified, and then he turned slightly away and made it 2 more times. Jake stood in the middle of all of Ith, was still embarrassed. He was profoundly embarrassed, but he was also watching a Sorvathy doctor who had spent the last hour in genuine fear for his life, now laughing with real joy, and a young insectoid medic who had been clicking in anxiety, now clicking in something entirely different, and a xenobiologist who was trying very hard to be composed and failing quietly in the corner. He felt something move through his chest. It was warm, and it was unexpected, and it was not embarrassment, it was something else. He sat back down on the edge of the bio bed, put his face in his hands. He started laughing too, and in the corridor outside the door, Grix the engineer made a ship-wide announcement that the emergency was resolved and the patient was stable and everyone could return to their quarters. And someone in the corridor immediately asked what had happened, and Grix said in a very carefully neutral voice, gas-related, and then the corridor erupted in sounds that needed no translation, and on the bio bed in the finest medical facility in Sector 7, Jake Mercer laughed until his eyes watered and his stomach hurt for an entirely different reason, and the green lights on the wall display stayed steady and calm and said very simply, "Human Milal systems normal." 3 days passed before Jake could walk into the mess hall without someone going quiet, not in a bad way, in the way that happens when a story is still very fresh and very funny and the people who were there are still replaying it in their minds at random moments and smiling without meaning to. It was the kind of quiet that had warmth in it, and Jake had learned to recognize the difference. He had apologized to each crew member individually. This took most of the first day. He went to every section of the ship with his translator working perfectly now with a brand new power cell, and he knocked on doors and sat in common rooms and found people at their stations, and he said, "I'm sorry for the alarm, and I'm sorry for waking everyone. And thank you for caring enough to panic on my behalf." The responses varied. Grix, the engineer, who was a Felhari, which meant she was small and covered in fine copper-colored fur and normally very serious about her work, pulled him into a side corridor and told him in a low voice that she had laughed so hard when she figured it out that she had knocked over a full cup of her shift beverage and shorted out a minor navigation display, and that she was not sorry and that he should not be sorry either. She said, "Humans are very funny." She said it like it was a compliment because it was. Some of the others were harder to read. Zorvan, the communications officer, who was Dovani like Prill, was extremely professional about the whole thing and said only that he was glad Jake had recovered and that the emergency response time had been excellent and a good drill for the crew. He said this with perfect seriousness, and then his mandibles clicked for 2 full seconds in the pattern that Prill had told Jake meant uncontrollable internal amusement. Jake took all of Ith, took the warmth and the teasing and the careful professional neutrality and the moment in the cargo bay when 3 junior crew members went totally silent when he walked in, and then erupted the moment the door closed behind him. He took all of it because he deserved it, and also because there was something underneath all of it that he had not expected. They were not laughing at him, they were laughing with him. There is a difference, and it matters, and Jake felt it clearly. On the 4th day he brought food to the medical bay. He brought what he could make in the ship kitchen with the supplies available, which was not exactly Earth food, but was close enough to feel like the right gesture. He brought something warm and something sweet, and he set it on the counter, and he stood in the doorway, and he said, "This is for you." Vexala was at her desk writing a report. She looked up, she looked at the food, she said, "You did not need to do this." He said, "I know." He said, "You were scared for me, and that matters even if it turned out to be beans." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "In Sorvathy medicine, there is a belief that fear for a patient means you have already begun to care for them." She said, "The fear comes first and the caring comes after, but they are part of the same thing." She looked at him. She said she had been afraid. She said she was glad she was wrong. Jake nodded. He sat down in the chair across from her desk, and they ate together in the medical bay of the finest trauma facility in Sector 7 and outside the viewport. The stars moved slowly past and the ship hummed around them, and it was a very ordinary moment and also not ordinary at all on the 7th. Dave Exala finished her report. It was addressed to the Coalition Bureau of Xenomedicine, and it was thorough and precise and written in the careful, formal language of official medical documentation. She described the incident completely. She described Jake's symptoms and the initial assessment and the preparation of the surgical suite and the moment the translator was repaired and what Jake had said and what had happened after. She did not soften any of it. She did not hide that she had been wrong, or that she had nearly performed surgery on a healthy man who needed a bathroom. She wrote it all because she was a doctor and the truth of a case mattered more than her professional pride, and because somewhere in the 14 months since humanity joined the Coalition, another alien medic was going to see a human in distress, and she did not want them to make the same mistake. She almost made at the end of the report. She wrote a formal addendum to the Homo sapiens medical profile. She added a full section on human digestive gas production. She wrote the biology clearly. She wrote the behavioral signs clearly. She wrote a diagnostic note that said if a human presents with abdominal distension and visible discomfort and signs of acute physical stress in the absence of abnormal core temperature or abnormal cardiac readings, the first intervention should not be surgical. She wrote ask the patient what they need. She wrote give them a translator that works. She paused. She thought about Jake in the corridor with both hands on the wall at 0200 hours. She thought about the 63 minutes. He had not made a sound of complaint the entire time. He had been embarrassed and patient and enduring, and he had never once lost his composure in the way she would have expected from a patient in that level of physical discomfort. She added one more line to the report. She wrote human pain tolerance and physical endurance should not be underestimated under any circumstances. The species has a documented history of surviving conditions that would be fatal to most known sapients, and they do so not through biological armor or superior strength, but through a combination of physiological resilience and what can only be described as a decision to continue. This decision appears to be culturally fundamental and individually consistent across observed cases. She read it back. She thought it was accurate. She submitted the report 3 weeks later. The Bureau of Xenomedicine sent a reply confirming receipt and informing her that her addendum had been reviewed and approved and would be incorporated into the standard medical profile distributed to all Coalition fleet physicians, and that a condensed version would be included in the emergency diagnostic supplement used in field medicine across 14 sectors. The reply also noted that her report had been shared at the Bureau's monthly staff meeting and that several senior physicians had required a brief recess afterward. It did not explain why. She had a feeling she knew. On the morning that reply arrived, Jake was at his station in the maintenance bay working on a secondary coolant coupling. He was humming something quiet and old, and he did not know that across 14 sectors medical staff were reading about him. He did not know that in 3 years there would be a standard notation in every alien emergency handbook in the Coalition fleet with his name attached to it, anonymously listed only as human subject. One, he did not know that the note would be famous. He would not have believed it if someone told him he was just a man from Earth doing his job on a ship far from home, missing beans and his mother's cooking and the particular quality of afternoon light that came through the window of the apartment where he grew up. He was ordinary in every way he could think of, and extraordinary in every way he could not. Sivexala kept the original report in a folder on her desk, not the official copy, the original draft, the one where her handwriting was slightly uneven in places because she had still been laughing when she wrote the first version. She kept it because it reminded her of something important. Medicine had taught her to look for what was wrong with a body. That night in the corridor had taught her something else. Sometimes the most remarkable thing about a patient is not what is failing, it is what is holding. Jake Mercer had held for 63 minutes in silence in a corridor, on a ship far from home with no translator and no way to explain himself, and 34 frightened aliens closing in around him. He had held not because he was a soldier or a hero or anything written in any file, but because he was human and humans hold. That was the thing the galaxy was still learning about them. That was the thing it would spend a long time learning, and somewhere in a maintenance bay, humming a song nobody else on the ship had ever heard, Jake Mercer tightened a coolant coupling and did not know he was famous, and the stars outside kept moving, and the ship kept flying, and the universe kept expanding in every direction at once into something larger and stranger and more full of wonder than any of them had words for yet, but they were learning one story at a time, one human at a time.